Skipping Christmas by John Grisham, Day 2. The gravity of their scheme hit hard the next day just after dinner. It was entirely possible to enjoy Christmas without cards, without parties and dinners, without needless gifts, without a lot of things that for some reason had been piled onto the birth of Christ. But how could anyone get through the holidays without a tree? Skip the tree? And Luther knew they might just pull it off. They were clearing the table, though there was precious little to clear. Baked chicken and cottage cheese made for an easy cleanup, and Luther was still hungry when the doorbell rang. "I'll get it," he said. Through the front window of the living room he saw the trailer out in the street, and he knew instantly that the next 15 minutes would not be pleasant. He opened the door and was met with 3 smiling faces, 2 youngsters dressed smartly in full Boy Scout regalia, and behind them Mr. Scanlon, the neighborhood's permanent scoutmaster. He, too, was in uniform. "Good evening," Luther said to the kids. "Hello, Mr. Crank. I'm Randy Bogan," said the taller of the two. "We're selling Christmas trees again this year." "Got yours out in the trailer," said the shorter one. "You had a Canadian spruce last year," Mr. Scanlon said. Luther glanced beyond them to the long flatbed trailer covered with 2 neat rows of trees. A small army of scouts was busy unloading and hauling them away to Luther's neighbors. "How much?" Luther asked. $90, answered Randy. "We had to go up a little 'cause our supplier went up too." "80 last year," Luther almost said, but held his tongue. Nora materialized from nowhere and suddenly had her chin on his shoulder. "They're so cute," she whispered. "The boys or the trees?" Luther almost asked, why couldn't she stay in the kitchen and let him slug his way through this one? With a big fake smile, Luther said, "Sorry, but we're not buying one this year." Blank faces, puzzled faces, sad faces. A groan from just over his shoulder as the pain hit Nora. Looking at the boys, with his wife literally breathing down his neck, Luther Crank knew that this was the pivotal moment. Snap here and the floodgates would open. Buy a tree, then decorate it, then realize that no tree looks complete without a pile of presents stuffed under it. "Hang tough, old boy," Luther urged himself, just as his wife whispered, "Oh, dear." "Hush," he hissed from the corner of his mouth. The boys stared up at Mr. Crank as if he'd just taken the last coins from their pockets. "Sorry we had to go up on the price," Randy said sadly. "We're making less per tree than last year," Mr. Scanlon added helpfully. "It's not the price, boys," Luther said with another bogus grin. "We're not doing Christmas this year. Gonna be out of town. No need for a tree. Thanks anyway." The boys began looking at their feet as wounded children will do, and Mr. Scanlon appeared to be heartbroken. Nora offered another pitiful groan, and Luther, near panic, had a brilliant thought. "Don't you boys go out west each year for a big camporee of some sort? New Mexico in August?" I seem to recall from a flyer. They were caught off guard, but all 3 nodded slowly. "Good, here's the deal. I'll pass on the tree, but you guys come back in the summer and I'll give you $100 for your trip." Randy Bogan managed to say thanks, but only because he felt obligated. They suddenly wanted to leave. Luther slowly closed the door on them, then waited. They stood there on the front steps for a moment or two, then retreated down the drive, glancing over their shoulders. When they reached the truck, another adult in uniform was told the bizarre news. Others heard it, and before long, activity around the trailer came to a halt as the scouts and their leaders grouped at the end of the Crank's driveway and stared at the Crank house as if aliens were on the roof. Luther crouched low and peeked around the open curtains of the living room. "What are they doing?" Nora whispered behind them, crouching too. "Just staring, I guess. Maybe we should have bought one." "No. Don't have to put it up, you know." "Quiet. Just keep in the backyard. Just keep it in the backyard." "Stop it, Nora. Why are you whispering? This is our house. Same reason you're hiding behind the curtains." He stood straight and closed the curtains. The scouts moved on, their trailer inching down the street as the trees on Hemlock Street were delivered. Luther built a fire and nestled into his recliner for some reading. Tax stuff. He was alone because Nora was pouting. A short spell that would be over by morning. He'd faced down the Boy Scouts, then who should he fear? More encounters were coming, no doubt, and that was one of the very reasons Luther disliked Christmas. Everybody selling something, raising money, looking for a tip, bonus, something, something, something. He grew indignant again and felt fine. He eased from the house an hour later. On the sidewalk that bordered Hemlock, he shuffled along, going nowhere. The air was cool and light. After a few steps, he stopped by the Beckers' mailbox and looked in the front window of the living room, not far away. They were decorating their tree, and he could almost hear the bickering. Ned Becker was balancing himself on the top rung of a small ladder and stringing lights, while Jude Becker stood back a step and carped directions. Jude's mother, an ageless wonder, even more terrifying than Jude herself, was also in on the fray. She was pointing directions to poor Ned, and her directions were in sharp conflict to those of Jude. String them here, string them there. That branch, no, that other branch. Can't you see that gap there? What on earth are you looking at?" Meanwhile, Rocky Becker, their 20-year-old dropout, was sitting on the sofa with a can of something, laughing at them and offering advice that was apparently being ignored. He was the only one laughing, though. The scene made Luther smile. It reinforced his wisdom, made him proud of his decision to simply avoid the whole mess. He shuffled along, filling his haughty lungs with the cool air, happy that for the first time in his life he was eliminated the dreaded ritual of the tree trimming. 2 doors down, he stopped and watched the Frohmeyer clan assault an 8-foot spruce. Mr. Frohmeyer had brought 2 kids to the marriage. Mrs. Frohmeyer had arrived with 3 of her own, and after which they produced another, making 6, the eldest of which was no more than 12. The entire brood was hanging ornaments and tinsel. At some point during every December, Luther overheard one of the neighborhood women comment on just how awful the Frohmeyer tree looked, as if he cared. Awful or not, they were certainly having a wonderful time draping it with tacky decorations. Frohmeyer did research at the university. $110,000 a year was the rumor, but with the 6 kids, there wasn't much to show for it. Their tree would be the last to come down after New Year's. Luther turned around and headed home. At the Beckers, Ned was on the sofa with an ice pack on his shoulder, Jude hovering over him, lecturing with her finger. The latter was on its side, being inspected by the mother-in-law. Whatever the cause of the fall, there was no doubt that blame would be placed on poor Ned. Great, thought Luther. Now I'll have to listen to the details of another ailment for the next 4 months. Come to think of it, Ned Becker had fallen off that ladder before, 5, maybe 6 years earlier, crashed into the tree, and knocked the whole thing over. Broke Jude's keepsake ornaments. She'd pouted for a year. What madness, thought Luther. Chapter 4. Nora and 2 friends had just captured a table at their favorite deli, a converted service station that still sold gas but also had designer sandwiches and latte and $3 a cup. As always, it was packed at noon, and the long lines attracted even more folks. It was a working lunch. Candy and Mary were the other 2 members of a committee to oversee an auction for the art museum. Around most of the other tables, similar fundraisers were being plotted with great effort. Nora's cell phone rang. She apologized because she had forgotten to turn it off, but Mary insisted she take the call away. Cell phones were buzzing all over the deli. It was Abby again, and at first she was puzzled as to how he had obtained her number. But then she routinely gave it away. "It's Abby from the Pumpkin Seed," she explained to Candy and Mary, thereby linking them to the conversation. They nodded with disinterest. Presumably everybody knew Abby from the Pumpkin Seed. He had the highest prices in the world, so if you shopped there, you could one-up anyone when it came to stationery. "We forgot to discuss your party invitations," Abby said, and Nora's heart froze. She, too, had forgotten the invitations, and she certainly didn't want to discuss them in front of Mary and Candy. "Oh, yes," she said. Mary had struck up a conversation with a volunteer at the next table. Candy was scanning the deli to see who wasn't there. "We won't be needing them either," Nora said. "No party?" Abby asked, his words laden with curiosity. "Yes, no party this year." "Well, thanks for calling, Abby," she said softly and quickly, and snapped the phone shut. "Won't be needed what?" Mary asked, suddenly breaking off her other conversation and honing in on Nora. "No party this year?" Candy asked, her eyes locking onto Nora's like radar. "What's up?" "Grit your teeth," Nora urged herself. "Think of beaches, warm salt water, 10 days in paradise." "Oh, that," she said. "We're taking a cruise this year instead of doing Christmas. Blair's gone, you know. We need a break." The deli was suddenly quiet, or at least it seemed so to Nora, and Candy and Mary frowned as they replayed this news. Nora, with Luther's words ringing in her ears, pushed the offensive. 10 days on the Island Princess, a luxury liner. Bahamas, Jamaica, Grand Cayman. "I've already lost 2 pounds," she said with a cheerful smugness. "You're not doing Christmas?" Mary said in disbelief. "That's what I said," Nora responded. Mary was quick with judgment, and years ago, Nora had learned to bite back. She stiffened, ready for a sharp word. "How do you simply not do Christmas?" Mary asked. "You skip it," Nora replied, as if that would explain everything. "Sounds wonderful," Candy said. "Then what do we do Christmas Eve?" Mary asked. "You'll think of something," Nora replied. "There are other parties, but none like yours. You're sweet." "When do you leave?" Candy asked, dreaming now of beaches and no in-laws piled in for a week. Christmas Day, around noon. It was an odd time to leave, she had thought after Luther had booked the cruise. "If we're not celebrating Christmas, dear," she'd said, "why not leave a few days earlier? Avoid Christmas Eve while we're at it. Eliminate the whole crazy mess." "What if Blair calls Christmas Eve?" he replied. "And besides, Biff got $399 knocked off the package because few people travel on the 25th. Anyway, it was booked and paid for, and nothing was going to change." "Then why not have the party on Christmas Eve anyway?" Mary asked, getting pushy, fearful that she might feel obligated to host a replacement. "Because we don't want to, Mary. We're taking a break, okay? A year off, no Christmas whatsoever, nothing, no tree, no turkey, no gifts. We're taking the money and splurging on a cruise. Get it?" I get it, Candy said. I wish Norman would do something like that. He wouldn't dream of it, though. Afraid he'd miss 20 or so bowl games. I'm so envious, Nora. And with that, Mary took a bite of her avocado sandwich. She chewed and began glancing around the deli. Nora knew exactly what she was thinking. Who can I tell first? The Cranks are skipping Christmas? No party? No tree? Nothing but money in their pockets so they can blow it on a cruise? Nora ate too, knowing that as soon as she stepped through the door over there, the gossip would roar through the deli, and before dinner everyone in her world would know the news. So what? She told herself. It was inevitable, and why was it such a big deal? Half would be in Candy's camp, burning with envy and dreaming along with Nora. Half would be with Mary, seemingly appalled at the notion of simply eliminating Christmas. But even within this group of critics, Nora suspected many would secretly covet their cruise. And in 3 months, who'd care anyway? After a few bites, they shoved their sandwiches aside and brought out the paperwork. Not another word was mentioned about Christmas, not in Nora's presence anyway. Driving away, she phoned Luther with the news of their latest victory. Luther was up and down. His secretary, a 50-year-old triple divorcee named Dox, had quipped that she'd have to buy her own cheap perfume, she supposed, since Santa wasn't coming this year. He'd been called Scrooge twice, and each time the name had been followed by a fit of laughter. How original, Luther thought. Late in the morning, Yank Slater darted into Luther's office as if angry clients were chasing him. Peeking out first, he closed the door, then assumed a seat. You're a genius, old boy, he said almost in a whisper. Yank was an amortization specialist, afraid of a shadow, loved 18-hour days because his wife was a brawler. Of course I am, said Luther. Went home last night, late, got the wife to bed, then did the same thing you did. Crunched the numbers, went through the bank statements, the works, came up with almost $7,000. What was your damage? Just over 6,000. Unbelievable, and not a rotten thing to show for it. Makes me sick. Take a cruise, Luther said, knowing full well that Yank's wife would never agree to such foolishness. For her, the holidays began in late October and steadily gathered momentum until the Big Bang, a 10-hour marathon on Christmas Day with 4 meals in a packed house. Take a cruise, Yank mumbled. Can't think of anything worse. Socked away in a boat with Abigail for 10 days. I'd pitch her overboard. And no one would blame you, Luther thought. $7,000, Yank repeated to himself. Ridiculous, isn't it? Luther said, and for a moment both accountants silently lamented the waste of hard-earned money. Your first cruise? Yank asked. Yes. Never done one myself. Wonder if they have single folks on board. I'm sure they do. There's no requirement you have to take a partner. Thinking of going solo, Yank? Not thinking, Luther. Dreaming. He drifted off, his hollow eyes showing a hint of hope, of fun, of something Luther had never seen before in Yank. He left the room there for a moment, his thoughts running wildly across the Caribbean, so wonderfully alone without Abigail. Luther was quiet while his colleague dreamed, but the dream soon became slightly embarrassing. Fortunately, the phone rang, and Yank was jolted back to a harsh world of amortization, tables, and a quarrelsome wife. He got to his feet and seemed to be leaving without a word. At the door, though, he said, You're my hero, Luther. Vic Fromeyer had heard the rumor from Mr. Scanlon, the scoutmaster, and from his wife's niece, who roomed with a girl who worked part-time for Abby at the Pumpkin Seed, and from a colleague at the university whose brother got his taxes done by someone at Wiley and Beck. 3 different sources, and the rumor had to be true. Crank could do whatever he danged well pleased, but Vic and the rest of Hemlock wouldn't take it lying down. Hemlock is the neighborhood. Fromeyer was the unelected ward boss of Hemlock. His cushy job at the university gave him time to meddle, and his boundless energy kept him on the street organizing all sorts of activities. With 6 kids, his house was the undisputed hangout. The doors were always open, a game always in progress. As a result, his lawn had a worn look to it, and though he worked hard in his flower beds. It was Fromeyer who brought the candidates to Hemlock for barbecues in his backyard and for their campaign pledges. It was Fromeyer who circulated the petitions, knocking door to door, gathering momentum against annexation or in favor of school bonds or against new four lane miles away or in favor of a new sewer system. It was Fromeyer who called sanitation when a neighbor's garbage was not picked up, and because it was Fromeyer, the matter got quickly resolved. A stray dog, one from another street, a call from Vic Fromeyer, and animal control was on the spot. A stray kid, one with hair and tattoos and the leery look of a delinquent, and Fromeyer would have the police poking him in the chest and asking questions. A hospital stay on Hemlock, and the Fromeyers arranged visitation and food and even lawn care. A death on Hemlock, and they organized flowers for the funeral and visits to the cemetery. A neighbor in need could call the Fromeyers for anything. The Frosties had been Vic's idea, though. though he'd seen it in the suburb of Evanston and thus couldn't take full credit. The same Frosty on every Hemlock roof, an 8-foot Frosty with a goofy smile around a corncob pipe and a black top hat and thick rolls around the middle, all made to glow a brilliant white by a 200-watt bulb screwed into a cavity somewhere near Frosty's colon. The Hemlock Frosties had made their debut 6 years earlier and were a smashing success. 21 houses on one side, 21 on the other, the street lined with 2 perfect rows of Frosties, 40 feet up. A color photo with a cute story ran on the front page. 2 television news crews had done it live. Reports. The next year, Stanton Street to the south and Ackerman Street to the north had jumped in with Rudolphs and Silver Bells, respectively, and a committee from Parks and Rec at Frohmeyer's quiet urging began giving neighborhood awards for Christmas decorations. 2 years earlier, disaster struck when a windstorm sent most of the Frosties airborne into the next precinct. Frohmeyer rallied the neighbors, though, and last year a new, slightly shorter version of Frosty decorated Hemlock. Only 2 houses had not participated. Each year, Frohmeyer decided the date on which to resurrect the Frosties, and after hearing the rumors about Crank and his crews, he decided to do it immediately. After dinner, he typed a short memo to his neighbors, something he did at least twice a month, ran 41 copies, and dispatched his 6 children to hand-deliver them to every house on Hemlock. It read, "Neighbor, weather tomorrow should be clear. An excellent time to bring Frosty back to life. Call Marty or Judd or myself if you need assistance. Vic Frohmeyer." Luther took the memo from a smiling kid. "Who is it?" Nora called from the kitchen. "Frohmeyer." "What's it about?" "Frosty." She walked slowly into the living room, where Luther was holding the half-sheet of paper as if it were a summons to jury duty. They gave each other a fearful look, and very slowly Luther began shaking his head. "You have to do it," she said. "No, I don't," he said very firmly, his temper rising with each word. "I certainly do not. I will not be told by Vic Frohmeyer that I have to decorate my house for Christmas. It's just Frosty." "No, it is much more." "What?" "It's the principle of it, Nora. Don't you understand? We can forget about Christmas if we dang well choose, and—" "Don't swear, Luther. "And no one, not even Vic Frohmeyer, can stop us." Louder. "I will not be forced into doing this." He was pointing to the ceiling with one hand and waving the memo with the other. Nora retreated to the kitchen. Chapter 5. A Hemlock Frosty came in 4 sections: a wide round base, a slightly smaller snowball that wedged into the base, then a trunk, then the head with a face, and a hat. Each section could be stuffed into the next larger one, so that storage for the other 11 months of the year was not too demanding. A cost of $82.99 plus shipping, everyone packed away their Frosties with care, and they unpacked them with great delight. Throughout the afternoon, sections of Frosties could be seen inside most garages along Hemlock as the snowmen were dusted off and checked for parts. Then they were put together, built just like a real snowman, section on top of section, until they were 7 feet tall and ready for the roof. Installation was not a simple matter. A ladder and a rope were required, along with the help of a neighbor. First, the roof had to be scaled with rope around the waist. Then Frosty, who was made of hard plastic and weighed about 40 pounds, was hoisted up, very carefully so as not to scratch him over the asphalt shingles. When Frosty reached the summit, he was strapped to the chimney with a canvas band that Vic Frohmeyer had invented himself. A 200-watt lamp was screwed into Frosty's innards, and an extension cord was dropped from the backside of the roof. Wes Trogdon was an insurance broker who'd called in sick so he could surprise his kids by having their Frosty up first. He and his wife, Trish, watched their snowman just after lunch, then under her close supervision. Wes climbed and grappled and adjusted until the task was complete. 40 feet high with a splendid view, he looked up and down Hemlock and was quite smug that he had got the jump on everyone, including Frohmeyer. While Trish made her hot cocoa, Wes began hauling boxes of lights up from the basement to the driveway, where he laid them out and checked circuits. No one on Hemlock strung more Christmas lights than the Trogdons. They lined their yard, wrapped their shrubs, draped their trees, outlined their house, adorned their windows. 14,000 lights the year before. Frohmeyer left work early so he could supervise matters on Hemlock, and he was quite pleased to see activity. He was momentarily jealous that Trogdon had beaten him to the punch, but what did it really matter? Before long they joined forces in the driveway of Mrs. Ellen Mulholland, a lovely widow who was already baking brownies. Her Frosty was up in a flash, her brownies devoured, and they were off to render more assistance. Kids joined them, including Spike Frohmeyer, a 12-year-old with his father's flair for organization and community activism, and they went door to door in the late afternoon, hurrying before darkness slowed them. At the Cranks, Spike rang the doorbell, but got no response. Mr. Crank's Lexus was not there, which was certainly not unusual at 5 p.m., but Mrs. Crank's Audi was in the garage, a sure sign that she was home. The curtains and the shades were pulled. No answer at the door, though, and the gang moved to the Beckers, where Ned was in the front yard, washing his Frosty with his mother-in-law, barking instructions from the steps. "They're leaving now," Nora whispered into the phone in their bedroom. "Why are you whispering?" Luther asked with agitation. "Because I don't want them to hear me. Who is it?" "Vic Fromeyer, West Trogdon. Looks like that Brixley fellow from the other end of the street. Some kids. A regular bunch of thugs, huh?" "More like a street gang. They're at the Beckers now. God help them." "Where's Frosty?" she asked. "Same place he's been since January. Why?" "Oh, I don't know." "This is comical, Nora. You're whispering into the phone in a locked house because our neighbors are going door to door helping our other neighbors put up a ridiculous 7-foot plastic snowman, which, by the way, has absolutely nothing to do with Christmas. Ever think about that, Nora?" "No. We voted for Rudolph, remember?" "No. It's comical. I'm not laughing. Frosty's taking a year off, okay? The answer is no." Luther hung up gently and tried to concentrate on his work. After dark he drove home slowly, all the way telling himself that it was silly to be worried about such trivial matters as putting a snowman on the roof. And all the way he kept thinking of Walt Scheel. "Come on, Scheel," he mumbled to himself. "Don't let me down." Walt Scheel was his rival on Hemlock, a grumpy sort who lived directly across the street. 2 kids out of college, a wife battling breast cancer, a mysterious job with a Belgian conglom, an income that appeared to be in the upper range on Hemlock. But regardless of what he earned, Scheel and the missus expected their neighbors to think they had a lot more. Luther bought a Lexus. Scheel had to have one. Bellington put in a pool. Scheel suddenly needed to swim in his own backyard. Doctor's orders. Sue Kropp on the West End outfitted her kitchen with designer appliances. $8,000 was the rumor, and Bev Scheel spent $9,000 6 months later. A hopeless cook. Bev's cuisine tasted worse after the renovation, according to the witnesses. Their haughtiness had been stopped cold, however, with the breast cancer 18 months earlier. The Scheels had been humbled mightily. Keeping ahead of the neighbors didn't matter anymore. Things were useless. They had endured the disease with the quiet dignity, and as usual, Hemlock had supported them like family. A year after the first chemo, the Belgian conglom had reshuffled itself. Whatever Walt's job had been, it was now something less. The Christmas before, the Scheels had been too distracted to decorate. No Frosty for them, not much of a tree, just a few lights strung around the front window, almost an afterthought. A year earlier, 2 houses on Hemlock had gone without Frosties. The Scheels and one up on the West End owned by a Pakistani couple who'd lived there 3 months then moved away. It had been for sale, and Fromeyer had actually considered ordering another Frosty and conducting a nighttime raid on the premises to erect it. "Come on, Scheel," Luther mumbled in traffic. "Keep your Frosty in the basement." The Frosty idea had been cute 6 years earlier when first hatched by Fromeyer. Now it was tedious, but Luther confessed, certainly not tedious to the kids on Hemlock. He had been secretly delighted 2 years before when the storm gusts cleared the roofs and sent Frosties flying over half the city. He turned onto Hemlock, and as far as he could see, the street was lined with identical snowmen sitting like glowing sentries above the houses. Just 2 gaps in their ranks, the Scheels and the Cranks. "Thank you, Scheel," Luther whispered. Kids were riding bikes. Neighbors were outside stringing lights, chatting across hedgerows. A street gang was meeting in Scheel's garage. Luther noticed as he parked and walked hurriedly into the house. Sure enough, within minutes a ladder went up and Fromeyer scurried up like a veteran roofer. Luther peeked through the blinds on his front door. There was Walt Scheel standing in the front yard with a dozen people, Bev, bundled up in a warm coat on the front steps. Spike Fromeyer was wrestling with an extension cord. There was shouts and laughter, and everyone seemed to be hurling instructions to Fromeyer as the next to the last Frosty in Hemlock was heaved. Little was said over a dinner of sauceless pasta and cottage cheese. Nora was down 3 pounds, Luther 4. After the dishes, he went to the treadmill in the basement, where he walked for 50 minutes, burning 340 calories, more than he had just consumed. He took a shower and tried to read. When the street was clear, he went for a walk. He would not be a prisoner in his home. He would not hide from his neighbors. He had nothing to fear from these people. There was a twinge of guilt as he admired the 2 neat lines of snowmen guarding their quiet street. The Trogdons were piling more ornaments on the tree, and it brought back a few distant memories of Blair's childhood and those faraway times. He was not the nostalgic type. You live life today, not tomorrow, certainly not yesterday, he always said. The warm memories were quickly erased with thoughts of shopping and traffic and burning money. Luther was quite proud of his decision to take a year off. His belt was a bit looser. The beaches were waiting. A bike rushed in from nowhere and slid to a stop. "Hi, Mr. Crank." It was Spike Fromeyer, no doubt, heading home after some clandestine juvenile meeting. The kid slept less than his father, and the neighborhood was full of stories about Spike's nocturnal ramblings. He was a nice boy, but usually unmedicated. "Hello, Spike," Luther said, catching his breath. "What brings you out?" "Just checking on things," he said as if he were the official night watchman. "What kind of things, Spike?" "My dad sent me over to Stanton Street to see how many Rudolphs are up." "How many?" Luther asked, playing along. "None. We smoked them again." What a victorious night the Fromeyers would have, Luther thought. Silly. "You putting yours up, Mr. Crank?" "No, I'm not, Spike. We're leaving town this year. No Christmas for us." "I didn't know you could do that." "This is a free country, Spike. You can do almost anything you want." "You're not leaving till Christmas Day," Spike said. "What? Noon's what I heard. You got plenty of time to get Frosty up. That way we can win the award again." Luther paused for a second and once more marveled at the speed with which one person's private business could be so thoroughly kicked around the neighborhood. "Winning is overrated, Spike," he said wisely. "Let another street have the award this year." "I guess so. Now run along." He rolled away and said, "See you later," over his shoulder. The kid's father was lying in ambush when Luther came strolling by. "Evening, Luther," Vic said, as if the encounter was purely by chance. He leaned on the mailbox at the end of his drive. "Evening, Vic," Luther said, almost stopping, but at the last second he decided to keep walking. He stepped around Fromeyer, who tagged along. "How's Blair?" "Fine, Vic, thanks. How are your kids?" "In great spirits. It's the best time of year, Luther. Don't you think so?" Fromeyer had picked up the pace, and the two were now side by side. "Absolutely. I couldn't be happier. Do miss Blair, though. It won't be the same without her." "Of course not." They stopped in front of Becker's, next door to Luther's, and watched as poor Ned teetered on the top step of the ladder in a vain effort to mount an oversized star on the highest branch of the tree. His wife stood behind him, helping mightily with her instructions, but not once holding the ladder, and his mother-in-law was a few steps back from the wide view. A fist-fight seemed imminent. "Some things about Christmas I'm not going to miss," Luther said. "So you're really skipping out?" "You got it, Vic. I'd appreciate your cooperation. Just doesn't seem right for some reason." "That's not for you to decide, is it?" "No, it's not. Good night, Vic." Luther left him there, amused by the Beckers.